chapter 10 today, walking a chapter at a time. Chapter 9, Pastor Ron did just an incredible job just breaking that down and talking about just this freedom that we have to be a slave to Christ. And really, as we walk into this chapter, Paul is continuing and he writes to these believers and he says, you know what, be careful that you don't fall into the same mess that the Israelites did. And he gives them some examples of just kind of the things that the Israelites had walked through. And if we, before we read any of that, I want to jump into what I think is maybe the key verse in this whole chapter, kind of maybe the one that kind of hinges everything together. In verse 12, he said, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he does not fall. Now, Paul says, those of you, if you think you're standing firm, he says, be careful that you don't fall. And he gives some examples. He says, hey, you know what? The self-confidence that maybe you have, the strong may have in the midst of this, he compares that to the attitude of the Israelites who had experienced the power of God. They experienced deliverance and salvation as God parted the Red Sea, as they crossed on dry land, and they find themselves grumbling and complaining instead of being grateful for just the goodness of God. And they're saying, you know what, hey, did God bring us out here to die? And they're just in all these kind of things. And in the midst of that, they violate their covenant with God. They put him to the test. And the example that Paul gives them in this is a warning to Christ followers who think that they're strong enough, and in this particular context, they think that they're strong enough to participate in these pagan feasts. That okay, we have freedom to do this, and Paul says, hey, you better be careful. You might find yourself overcome with temptation, and the God that gives us freedom is a God that tolerates no idol worship, and in the midst of this participation of these banquets, these pagan things where idol meat was served and all those kind of things, it would have brought with it the temptation to participate in other elements of the banquet and idol worship. And Paul writes to these believers and he says, you know what, you better be careful. He said, you need to take heed that you don't fall. And I think in this specific context, verse 13 says there's no temptation but such as common unto man. And we quote this verse a lot. And he says that God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, and with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, that you will be able to endure it. And I think that we use this verse a lot. We say, you know what, there's no temptation that God's not going to provide a way out of, that we're not, he's always going to give us that ability. And I believe in this passage, Paul's reminding them that maybe the way out is before you're so far in the midst of the temptation. And for these believers that think they're strong, I think Paul is saying, hey, if you feel like maybe you have freedom to participate in, being part of some of these things, that you may recognize, you take heed, and instead of doing that, instead of they may say, you know what, we have a right to participate in these, we have freedom to do all those kind of things, and to decline that invitation, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard maybe for them. But Paul says, you know what, God's faithful. This test and your willingness to stand, your willingness to, and even the very next verse says that we are to flee from idolatry. And he says your choice to remove yourself from those kind of things is going to reveal your faithfulness to follow Jesus. And you don't need to worry, because God's going to provide a way out. And we are almost out of time already. But Paul goes on, and I want to just kind of sew this up. He says all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. And he says, let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. And so we want to think about what we do and the influence that it has on somebody else. We want to think about those kind of things. And Paul's just really navigating that. And he says, whatever you do, in verse 31, he says, eat, drink, whatever you do. He said, whether then you eat or you drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. And what Paul's saying is that man, as followers of Jesus Christ, we need to be careful. We need to take heed that we don't fall into temptation. We're not as strong as we think we are sometimes, and we get that arrogant way. And Paul says that pride, right, is going to result in a fall, right? That we don't want to have that he resists the proud, gives grace to the humble. We don't want to have this attitude of, I'm strong enough to handle it. I can face temptation. I can do all of these kind of things. But we want to have this attitude that says, you know what, I'm going to flee from immorality, and I'm going to live my life, and I'm going to be willing. And Paul, I believe, is clear in this. He says we want to be willing to give up our freedoms that might cause someone else to stumble, that we want to be willing to do those things, not seeking our own good, but the good of many, and that all might be saved, that we might view our role as a believer in Jesus Christ and our platform and the representation of Christ to this world in a way that we would flee and do anything that we can, that we would give up even freedoms that we think we may have to live our life in a way that would keep others from stumbling, and it would do no harm to the name of Christ. Hope that helps as we just connect in the Word of God. Again, we're out of time, but encourage you just to dig into this chapter, and that we might be a people that would do whatever we do for the glory of God. Everything would be with that heart and not our own. God bless, and have a great day.